All right. Well, everyone, I'd like to welcome you to the Alaska State Museum. I'm Steve Henrikson, Curator of Collections here. And Quinn said that you guys might like to hear the story of Alaska's moon rocks, which we happen to have on display right here in this case. There's the one I'll be talking about today is right here from Apollo 11, and then the one on top, very similar to the bottom one, is from Apollo 17. So this is from the first moon landing, and this is from the last moon landing. And I got involved in the moon rock, even though the moon rock actually was given to us shortly after the Apollo 11 came back from the moon in 1969. I didn't come here until 1988, so that was 30-some years ago. And my first week on the job, I overlapped the first week with the former curator, and she just tried to fill me in on everything that I would need to know in the coming years about what's happening. And she handed me a folder, and she says, well, this is the information on the missing moon rock, and you're gonna hear about this at some point, so you better familiarize yourself with what's in the file. And there's different documents in there about what it was and what happened to it, because the moon rock was missing. It had been missing since the early 70s. And we had no idea, nobody had any idea really, not nobody, but the one person knew what happened to it, but no one else did. So I, read through it and put it in the filing cabinet. And 20-some years later, the chief curator of the museum came down and said, well, Steve, we're getting sued. Do you know anything about a moon rock? And I said, well, actually, I do know something about a moon rock, and pulled that file folder out, and I'll be telling you the story of what happened after that. But just a little bit of background. Of course, Apollo 11 is a very historical event where after years and years of testing and lives lost and a lot of technological innovation and expenditure of billions of dollars, the United States government sent a manned mission to the moon. And the astronauts involved are Neil Armstrong on the left, Michael Collins in the middle, and Buzz Aldrin on the right. And part of the mission, of course, was scientific at its very root. They're investigating some very basic issues involved with the history of the moon, where it came from, how it was captured in orbit around the Earth, and lots of other basic information at that time wasn't known. So they were doing it for scientific purposes, but also it was done for political reasons too. It was there was a space race going on with the Soviet Union and other countries, and there's really a lot of competition between rival nations to be the first country to be able to pull off this major technological challenge to get living human beings to the moon and back, ideally with cargo, which would be the moon rocks. So it's not purely scientific. There were lots of political reasons for it, and as we know now, it's actually America and other countries are trying to return to the moon. We haven't totally abandoned it, and now there's a whole new system for getting people up there. But back in July of 1969, I was a 7-year-old boy living in Washington State, and I was totally captured by what they were doing. It was, a big it was every night on the news there were stories about the mission that was coming up, and nobody really knew what was going to happen with that. They thought they had all the bugs worked out, but there were still a lot of questions about, you know, how it was going to come down. There were several Apollo missions before that to test out various systems. This was the 11th Apollo mission to take all that they had learned from the previous missions and make sure it all worked well together. And there had been several catastrophes that had happened with this program. Astronauts had died, and there was a lot riding on it. This was me back in the day I've got my model of the Saturn V rocket, and this was at Christmas and my birthday party. My mom made a space capsule cake for me. So I was in this hook, line, and sinker, and I started writing to NASA asking for information on the different systems they were testing in different programs, and I had a whole filing cabinet full of color photographs that they sent and all these technical reports, and I was really into it. As far as Alaska's connection to this, there's not much of a direct connection, although the astronauts, at least the original astronauts, came to Alaska to Katmai National Park to study geology. They were looking for places on the Earth that they thought resembled what the moon was going to be like in different ways, had similar rocks, or just the terrain was similar, and the volcanic area around Katmai National Park they thought was going to be somewhat like the landscape of the moon. So the astronauts did come to Alaska as part of their training. And when the big day actually happened, let's see, this was, I think it was July 20th was when they actually landed on the surface of the moon. This was from the New York Times the next day. They actually had gotten television signals as well as still photos sent back from the moon. And it was a big deal. A lot of people had it. They were able to live stream it, as we say today, on the television, black and white TV primarily, and a lot of people stayed home and watched that, including me. I was pretty excited about it. And this was a big moment when they unfurled the American flag on the surface of the moon. Of course, there is no wind on the moon, so the flag had to be held out by a stick along the top. And as far as, they were hoping to bring back a good selection of different kinds of rocks they were able to find on the moon. They were very limited in their capacity for carrying very much lunar material back with them. A rock of this size, it would be impressive, but there's no way they're getting it back on the ship. It slightly exceeds the carry-on dimensions, as we say today. They had to invent tools and a whole protocol for picking rocks up. They couldn't bend over all the way wearing these suits. So they had some tools with multiple attachments on them, either little claws or a scoop like this. And back on Earth, they practiced picking up rocks of different sizes with these tools. There's one with little pinchers on the end. I imagine that would come in handy too if any aliens jumped out when they were on the moon and they needed to defend themselves. Just kidding. But they documented all of their collecting to the hilt. They even had photographs of the collecting field, and each of the samples that they took got a number, and it was plotted on these photographs where they came from. And of course, when they successfully returned to Earth, they were instant worldwide celebrities. This was a ticker tape parade in New York City. There were riding in the convertibles there. And they received a hero's welcome, and to this day they're all pretty much household names, at least in my house they are. So this was the container that they placed all the moon rocks in. Everything that they collected on that mission had to fit in that suitcase. They were really concerned about bringing home microbes, viruses, germs, etc. from the Earth that didn't exist, or from the moon that didn't exist on Earth. And if they weren't careful, they could unleash a plague on the Earth and kill everybody. So that would really ruin all the good publicity that they had so far. So they really wanted to make sure that didn't happen, and they devised a pretty elaborate procedure for getting the moon rocks back and containing them, so there's no way anything's going to get out of that suitcase. They had the suitcase milled out of a solid block of aluminum, so there's no seams whatsoever except for where the main door is, and that had a gasket, a corrosion-proof gasket seal on there to prevent anything from getting out of there. And it was able to carry like 40 pounds of rocks is all. Yeah, here, 47.7 pounds were packed in there by Apollo 11, including our moon rock was once in that suitcase. And it's pretty interesting. It looks kind of like a normal suitcase, except for the way it's constructed. So once they got the moon rocks back, they had to figure out how they were going to get it to the LRL, the Lunar Receiving Lab in Houston, Texas. That's where the Johnson Space Center was and is. And so they had various ways of getting it back there depending on where in the world they landed. They weren't sure where they were going to land when they left, and so they had to have all kinds of alternate plans to get it back there. And in this case, they landed in the ocean, of course, and then they had to fly it. Well, it went on to a Navy aircraft carrier. It was then transported by car to Houston. And they had a whole building set up there in Houston to receive and contain the lunar specimens. It's the LRL was designed to have negative air pressure, so it would be hard for germs, viruses, etc. to get out of the building. This is the photo on the left is when they were bringing it into the building for the first time. And they also had procedures for if something did get let out of the lab, some kind of biological material that could contaminate the Earth, they had a way of sealing off that part of the building or the entire building if they had to. And I guess as a last-ditch effort to contain it, they were planning to bury the building. They had the scientists that worked inside had to have somewhere in their contract that, oh yeah, if something gets out, we're going to have to bury you alive, and that's just tough luck. And they had to agree to live under those conditions. Luckily, they didn't have to do that ever. And then this shows a technician at in those years working on some of the moon rocks. They're kept inside a enclosure in the building, and they're not actually touching the rocks or exposing them, not only to keep anything with the moon rocks from getting out on Earth, but also to keep the Earth's atmosphere from contaminating the lunar specimens. They wanted to keep them as pristine as possible. So you had to put your hands through the wall in these gloves and then handle them with the gloves. So Alaska's part of this came as because they had a program once the moon rocks had been studied and it was relatively certain that they weren't going to contaminate everything, they wanted to share some of the moon rocks to each of the 50 states in the United States and also to 250 some odd foreign countries. They really put out the idea that this was not just America's project, it belonged to everybody on Earth. So they wanted to send a moon rock to all the countries too. And so they had a ceremony in Washington, D.C. where they presented our governor at the time, Keith Miller, with a small sample of the moon rock, along with a flag of the state that was carried to the moon. They actually had miniature flags that they carried on board the spaceship, and one for each state and one for each country, and that was mounted below there, as you can see on the original. So that's a picture of President Nixon holding that display right there. And this is a picture of it. There's 4 or 5 small moon rocks in that little lucite plastic sphere that's attached near the top. And then right below that is Alaska's flag. And Benny Benson, the designer of the flag, you've probably heard of him. He was a boy when they had a contest to design the territorial flag, and he was the winner of the contest. And a reporter asked him what his greatest achievement was in his life. And I sort of expected to read that he said it was designing the flag, but he said it was that his flag flew to the moon. Because I guess he saw that the moon rock has a Alaska flag with it, so he was very proud of the fact that he designed that flag. And if you ever have a chance to look through the rest of the museum, you can see his original design for the flag that's on display in there. And this was presented to the people of Alaska, commemorating the Apollo 11 trip. And then after Governor Miller got it, he brought it back to Alaska, and the governor's office had it on display for a while. And then he turned it over to our museum, and it was sent out of here to schools all over the state. It traveled with the National Guard, a detachment of the National Guard, who guarded it 24/7 while it was on the road. So it was a pretty big deal. Eventually it came back to a branch of our museum in Anchorage that was called the Transportation Branch of the Alaska State Museum. It was an aviation museum, and so it was on display up there. There's Benny's original design for the flag, in fact. It's the one that we have right around the corner. It's his original design. So this is a picture of the moon rock, a very poor picture of it that was published in newspapers as it traveled around. Usually the local newspapers had a story about the moon rock, and there's a picture of it. So this was our Transportation Museum in Anchorage, which was operating from the 1960s to like 1973, when unfortunately there was a fire there. And this leads me to the story of how that moon rock went missing. In 1973, there was a pretty bad fire at this museum. There was a lot of aviation fuel in some of these airplanes that fueled the fire. And it burned a lot of these exhibits. This was one of the few pictures we have of what the exhibits were like. And somewhere in this photo is the moon rock. I can't remember exactly where it is. I think they just had it on that table there for people to look at. There's some kids in the museum. And this was the only photo that we had of what the moon rock was like before it went missing after the fire was this one, when the moon rock visited Glen Allen School. And this Gene and Marie White, we contacted them as a result because of the investigation about the disappearance of the moon rock. We got the copy of this photo from them, and they said this was the biggest moment in their lives at the time, was getting to hold this rock. And the National Guard, they kept it in their house. They owned a roadhouse along the Alaska Highway, and the moon rock was kept overnight at their house, and the National Guard stayed in their house too with it. And that was a big deal for them, and they were really happy to play a part in the recovery of it, because this was actually the best photo we had before the fire of what the moon rock looked like. And the FBI actually used this photo, and using their techniques for analyzing photos, they were able to prove that the one in this photo was the one that we got back from the guy who took it. So anyway, this is what happened during the fire. The whole building burned up, all kinds of airplanes, cars. There was a kayak in there. Because it was a transportation museum, they also talked about how Alaska Natives, how they got around too. So we had some kayaks in there too, but mostly airplanes. And a lot of the airplanes were burned. This is Phil Redden, the curator of the museum at the time, looking over what was left of this airplane. And so that fast forward to 10 years ago, like 2013, we got out of the blue a lawsuit sent to the Attorney General's office suing the state of Alaska for ownership of the moon rock, the Apollo 11 moon rock. And it was the guy that was suing us was named Coleman Anderson. And we had never heard of Coleman Anderson, and I scratched my head trying to figure out, well, who is this guy? So I Googled him, and this picture came up, and it turns out he was a captain on the first season of The Deadliest Catch, that show on crabbing in Alaska. And it turns out that he is a fisherman today, but how he was connected to this fire at the Aviation Museum in 1973, we weren't sure of. So I did a little bit more digging and I found that Phil Redden, the curator there, was deceased, so I couldn't ask him about it. But I did find his obituary, and it listed Coleman Anderson as a foster child of Phil Redden. So there was the connection. He was a family member, but it still didn't explain how it was that he got the moon rock. But after the fire, it turns out that there was no other location for anything that survived the fire. There was no place to put that stuff. It was just a burned out shell of a building with a lot of wrecked airplanes in it. And we had witnesses that said the moon rock survived the fire. And we figured that Phil Redden took it home with him for safekeeping until they got a new place for the museum. But they never did replace the museum. It just went out of business totally. The staff was laid off, and the collection was just kind of whatever salvaged aircraft ended up going to a completely different museum, and nobody ever went back to get the moon rock, except anyway, it was still kind of a mystery how he ended up with it. But the Attorney General's office of the state, of course, was representing the State Museum in this lawsuit. This is Neil, can't think of his last name. Yeah, sorry about that. I'll think of it in a bit. Anyway, Neil represented us, and he got the AG's office to investigate, and we did find a little bit more information out about what happened to it. The Coleman Anderson, the guy that was suing us, said that it survived the fire, but it was in pieces. They found pieces of it around, and he spent many hours painstakingly polishing the wood and putting it back together so that it could be intact. And the flag was shriveled up from the heat, and he had to iron it out and put it all back together. And he said that his dad gave it to him for all of his work putting it back together. The guy said his dad gave it to him, but that's not how it works. I'm a curator of this museum. I can't give anything here away. It's state property, and there's a mechanism if for some reason we want to get rid of something, which is very rare. We have to go through about 10 different people to get permission to do that, and the paperwork has to be signed off on by